be wearing to the grave. Mcbride calls the socks a tribute to the former Navy pilot's lifetime of service. We spoke yesterday with the man who's been a spiritual guide in Mr. Bush's life for the past decade. He was actually in the room during the final hours for both the president and his wife, Barbara, who died in April. He told us the president's final moments were like something that anyone would have wanted, surrounded by loving family and friends, ready to leave this world for the next.
I see history as a book with many pages.
Today, another page in the history book turns.
And each day, we fill a page with acts of hopefulness and meaning.
As the nation honors one of the country's most devoted public servants.
This is America.
He built a life around the theme of his most famous speech.
A brilliant diversity, spread like stars, like 1,000 points of light in a broad and peaceful sky.
And shown as a young Navy pilot in World War II, serving decades in government, from CIA director to vice president to the nation's highest office.
So help me God.
Less than a year into his term, the Berlin Wall fell. And a decisive victory for the U.S. military in the Gulf War led to high approval ratings. But he was criticized for not removing Saddam Hussein from power, while some point to a broken campaign promise.
Read my lips. No new taxes.
As one of the reasons he was a one-term president.
And this man whom I'd always liked and respected and then run against in a painful campaign in some ways, I literally came to love.
Most of all, George Herbert Walker Bush cherished family.
After both Jeb and George were elected governor on the same day, I was flying home to Houston from Florida, and I said to Barbara, "This is the happiest day in my life." And she said, "What about the day we're married?" I said, "That was a nice day, too."
President and Mrs. Bush had an unshakable bond, even after her death. And in his last moments, close friend and former Secretary of State James Baker said the president spoke his final words in a phone conversation.
The very last words he spoke were spoken to George W. Bush, President Bush 43, who had told him how much he loved him and that he would see him on the other side. And 41 said, "I love you too."
And this was a family that really did love each other. Right now, we are waiting for members of the Bush family who will accompany the former president's casket to Ellington Field Joint Reserve Base. Omar Villafranca is outside George H. Lewis and Sons Funeral Home here in Houston, which is handling arrangements for the Bush family. Omar, good morning.
Good morning, Bianna. We're expecting members of the Bush family to arrive here at the funeral home shortly. It'll be a very choreographed dance here that goes on. The family will arrive, then they will load up into the motorcade, and then they will start the 26-mile trek to Ellington Field. Now, in my line of sight right now, there's more than a dozen, obviously, officers here on motorcycles who are ready to take the motorcade to Ellington. It'll take them roughly 45 minutes. This is the fourth largest city in the country. There will be traffic, but that motorcade will help them cut through there. Once they get to Ellington Field, there's going to be roughly 350 dignitaries, members of the Houston City Council, commissioners, and other people and luminaries from the city of Houston ready there to see the president off. Now, of course, as he loads onto the airplane that was sometime used as Air Force One, they will head to Andrews Air Force Base in Washington, D.C. And as you mentioned, a lot of people are talking about it. Sully the dog, as well as members of the Bush family, will be there on that trip as they head to Washington, D.C. Then there'll be another ceremony at 3:30 Eastern time this afternoon to honor the late president. He will then be taken to the U.S. Capitol, where his body will lie in state. The Capitol will be open around the clock to allow the public to pay its respects. Now, Mr. Bush will stay at the Capitol until Wednesday. There will be a memorial service at the National Cathedral. Then he'll depart to Washington, return to Houston for a private ceremony, and then, of course, he will be taking a train to College Station, where he will be laid to rest at his library. Bianna?
Omar, thank you. And Nora and John, anecdotally, I've spoken to a few of my fellow Houstonians here who've already said they're going to line up outside and they're going to be saluting their commander-in-chief and their neighbor as well. So many in the city love him.
Oh, so many people do. Bianna, thank you. And the former president is due to arrive in Washington in about 5 hours from now and will be brought to the U.S. Capitol, where he served as a congressman in the late 60s and as vice president in the 80s. Nancy Cordes is there on Capitol Hill. Nancy, good morning.
Good morning. The casket will arrive here later today, Nora, on the east front of the Capitol behind me, and then it will be taken out of the hearse by a military honor guard, which will then carry the casket up the steps of the Capitol behind me and into the Capitol Rotunda. George H.W. Bush will be just the 11th president to lie in state in the Rotunda of the U.S. Capitol. The last was Gerald Ford back in 2007. We will be able to witness a brief bipartisan ceremony saying goodbye, and then the doors will be open to the public. They'll be lining up this afternoon. Members of the public will be able to walk through, pay their respects, say goodbye all night long, and the casket of George H.W. Bush will continue to lie in state in the Rotunda until Wednesday morning, when it is brought to the National Cathedral for the funeral.
Thank you, Nancy.
Nancy, thank you. CBS News Chief White House Correspondent Major Garrett is here, along with CBS News contributor and former Chief Washington Correspondent Bob Schieffer. And USA Today's Washington Bureau Chief Susan Page is also with us. Good morning to all of you. Good morning. It seems to me, Bob, we have three people. We have George Bush the father, George Bush the politician, and George Bush the president. I want to start with this. He was a lifelong public servant. That's not so much in favor in Washington these days. Talk about the career of George Bush before he ever became president.
Well, he did it all. I mean, you know, he's the last of our World War II presidents. He was one of the shapers of the world order after World War II, and he was at the United Nations. He was later the head of the CIA. Then he went on to be our first envoy to China. He punched he got his ticket punched a lot of different ways, and he clearly learned from that experience. He represented mainstream Republican thought at that particular time. He was a mainstream Republican as we knew the Republican Party in those days. He was an internationalist. He had a great respect for alliances. He believed that the United States always did better when it worked with allies who shared our values. And it worked for him, and it worked for the country.
You know, Bob, it's been said that he was the most qualified man to ever reach the office of the presidency because he had held so many of those positions that you just mentioned, and that he may have been one of the most consequential because he was president at the time of the Cold War. And Susan, how did he govern as a president? How was he inside? You covered him inside the White House.
You know, he was a very collaborative president, and he was one who worked across party lines. He had spent, in all these previous jobs, he had spent time with people on the other side, so there wasn't the kind of, it's not that it was a golden era of bipartisanship, but it was not the kind of frozen into two camps the way that we seem to be now. And, you know, one thing he was willing to do was to take jobs nobody wanted. He took two jobs that no politician with ambition wanted. He took over chairmanship of the Republican National Committee during Watergate because Nixon wanted to do that. And then he took over an embattled CIA when President Ford asked him to do that. This was right after the Frank Church hearings that had left the CIA in such bad odor where so many people. So it's a surprise that he survived to become president after agreeing to take on those two difficult tasks.
And that gives you a sense of when we talk about public service, what are we talking about? It is taking tough tasks because it's your duty, even though it's not going to get you up the ladder, which is just so different than what we see today. Major, President Bush said, prudence is a value, and I hope experience matters when he was in the presidency. Talk a little bit about how he used that experience to get things done with a very democratic
So what was his experience when he arrived in Congress in the mid-'60s? Not only was the Cold War really important, there was a shooting war going on in Vietnam, bipartisanship around the question of national survival and up against the communist threat was a real thing. It was existential to our country's orientation to itself and to its future and to our politics. George Bush, as president, oversaw the calm end of the Cold War. And yet, with that came a decoupling from this sense of existential threat, and our politics became much more partisan because, guess what? You could be partisan without the risks associated with the Cold War. One of the reasons we were bound closer together during the Cold War is because of this external threat. The threat was removed, and our politics became a little bit more partisan because we could indulge that partisanship. And some of those strains first showed up against H.W. Bush when he was president, not in the Democratic Party, in his own party.
Right.
And even so, he maintained this organic approach to the legislative mission of the presidency, which is to get things done. And you look at those 4 years, more things were accomplished across the aisles in those 4 years than almost any other one-term president in modern America.
I think that's worth revisiting that. What was accomplished with a fully Democratic-controlled Congress, the Americans for Disability Act, the Clean Air Act, right?
Civil Rights Act.
Civil Rights Act.
Increasing...
renewal of it, yes.
Yes. So we're increasing the unemployment changes and also the wages.
And budget reform. Right?
You know, I think one of his great strengths was his ability to restrain rhetoric and to keep the tone as calm as possible. I think he had a great deal to do. It's not my phrase, but I think he had a great deal to do with the Cold War ending in a whimper rather than a bang, because when the Berlin Wall fell, he knew not to run out and brag about it because, and George W. Bush told me this himself, he said he had this great ability to put himself in the other guy's shoes. He knew he was going to needed the help of Gorbachev to have this thing come out right. The French, the British, they were not so sure when the Berlin Wall fell if Germany should be allowed to unite. That was not a popular thing in Europe at that point, but he knew that it was, and because of the restraint he showed at the time, he was able to get those things done.
And that restraint was so important because if Gorbachev were pushed into a corner by an end zone dancing American president, he might have overreacted and created that kind of Cold War tension that would have put Bush in a fix. So that restraint really gave Gorbachev the room to maneuver.
And at the time, it was not appreciated.
Absolutely.
Within the Republican Party, there was certainly a sense that President Bush did not know how to rhetorically explain this moment to the country, that there wasn't this celebration. There wasn't this moment of American triumphalism that we all deserved and we'd spent 60 years trying to accomplish, and that he wasn't fit for the moment. His orientation was, I'll take that criticism for the longer-term gains of stability.
And both Democratic leaders in Congress were hitting him on it, too. So he was getting it from the left and the right. Susan, in his diary, in John Meacham's book about George Bush, he wrote that they, meaning the extremists in his party, will destroy the party. This was his feeling about the... give us your sense of Newt Gingrich and his rise happening within the Bush presidency.
Well, it was really the rise of a new right in the Republican Party. It meant today there is no remnant of the moderate New England Republicanism that his father, Prescott Bush, represented as senator from Connecticut. It was a time of real change in the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, in part, as Major was saying. President Bush was in a way a victim of his own success. He'd helped negotiate the peaceful end of the Cold War, and then Americans said, okay, great, we've defeated the Soviet Union. What about us? And he never seemed to be able to make that pivot after the end of the first Persian Gulf War to people's concerns about problems they had at home with getting a job and getting a raise and sending their kids to a good college. It wasn't where his heart was. His heart was really in those big foreign policy challenges. Americans since that, and Bill Clinton came along, very much tuned into people's anxieties about their own lives.
But, you're talking on putting public service before politics. I mean, that's how he got himself beat when he ran for re-election. I covered that campaign in '88. Every 5 minutes, he would say, read my lips, no new taxes. And then when the deficit blew completely out of control, he recognized that he had to do something about it. He had to go back on that promise. And he did raise taxes, and it worked. It got the economy back operating again. But it also cost him the election because a lot of people on the right simply never forgave him.
He had, and as George W. Bush had told me, too, it was the fracturing of the Republican base, that pledge and the breaking of that promise fractured the Republican Party. Then some say led us to where we are today with a presidency led by President Donald Trump. I want to touch base with Paula Reed. She is at the White House. Paula, good morning. What have we heard from the president and how he will be involved in these funeral services?
Nora, here at the White House, the flag continues to fly at half-staff, and over the past few days, President Trump has said nothing but kind words for former President Bush. He has praised his sound judgment, common sense, and what he described as unflappable leadership. And this may come as a surprise to many people because historically, President Trump has had quite a combative relationship with the Bush family, with the two sides publicly trading insults. President Trump has criticized President George W. Bush's war in Iraq as a disaster on many occasions. He even mocked Senior Bush's 1,000 points of light philosophy on volunteerism. And of course, used to refer to Jeb Bush as low energy Jeb in the 2016 Republican primary. Not surprisingly, President Trump is not widely liked within the Bush family. Senior Bush told people he didn't like him. He believed that he was a blowhard. George W. Bush has criticized his nativism that Donald Trump promotes. And even Barbara Bush, of course, famously told you she wasn't sure why people would even vote for him. So it may come as somewhat of a surprise that he will participate in this week's funeral festivities, but he is being included mostly because both sides have an incentive to declare a truce here and not make this week about President Trump. For President Trump, the former President Bush draws a sharp contrast. I mean, he was a war hero. He served in Congress, the State Department, the CIA. He was born into this political family and really treasured a lot of the norms in Washington that the president criticizes on a daily basis. So it appears that former President Bush wanted Trump included in these events so that he would not become the center of attention. And it's fair to say that as we see President Bush alongside the other members of this small fraternity of former presidents, it may even highlight just how isolated he is from his predecessors.
All right, Paula Reed at the White House, and we are awaiting what will be the first pictures of the Bush family, who in Houston are gathering at the funeral home and will travel together on what is traditionally Air Force One, but when it doesn't have the current president of the United States, it is given a new name, and it's called Special Air Mission 41 to represent the 41st president indeed. Let's talk a little bit about it, because I think that idea about where the Republican Party is today is so different than when either former President George H.W. Bush or his son led the Republican Party. Do we know, did former President Bush even vote for Donald Trump?
He voted for Hillary Clinton. Yeah. And his wife wrote in Jeb Bush's name.
And that probably was the first time he's never voted for a Republican.
That's the first time either of them had ever not voted for the Republican.
And George W. Did not vote for Trump, but did not reveal who he did vote for, if memory serves.
But now George P. Bush, for the next generation of Bushes, you talk about a new Republican Party. George P. Bush is much more in tune with the current Republican Party. He supported Trump. He led, in fact, the Texas Victory Committee that helped President Trump as a nominee in 2016. He did a fundraiser with they scheduled a fundraiser with Donald Trump Jr. That may have gotten canceled, but it was scheduled. They have some kind of relationship. So he reflects the more conservative tone of the Republican Party today.
And he also wants to have a future in politics.
He does.
This isn't just a family opinion. This is somebody who wants
that's kind of a cynical view, John. I don't know where you get that.
I just want to point out, as we're looking at these live pictures of the funeral home in Houston that prepares to take the family to Ellington Air Force Base, that we're hearing from Jim McGrath, who is President Bush's spokesperson. He said for this first movement in Houston, in this state funeral, members of the current Secret Service Bush Protective Division will serve as honorary pallbearers, which, if you know about the Bushes, they were so well regarded by not only the White House staff, but also the Secret Service.
You know, I interviewed President Bush almost exactly a year ago in November 2017 at his office in Houston, and you could just tell how much affection there was between him and his Secret Service unit, which had been with him for a long time. And one of the sons, one of the very young sons of one of the agents, got leukemia, lost all his hair because of the treatment. So all the agents shaved their heads for solidarity with this little boy, and George Bush did too.
Shaved. I mean, and to see an older, he was what, 93 then? Was that when it?
A little bit younger, maybe about 90.
Yeah, and shaving his head in solidarity with the Secret Service agents.
But he was very inclusive for anybody on the team. He understood that, and I think that is one of the reasons he was so successful in during those days when the Cold War was coming to an end. He had known a lot of people in diplomacy. He had known a lot of people in the military. And he had good relationship with them, and he encouraged that. That's one of the reasons he wrote all those notes. That's why he wrote to you. You know,
To the audience, these notes that Bob just referred to, typewritten notes that George Bush wrote throughout his political career. Small notes, small measures of respect to build a political network, yes, but also to demonstrate a kindness and a sense of humility. Those notes were probably more adhesive and more important to his political future than almost anything else he ever did. And he never considered himself part of a visionary mission within the Republican Party. There was no outsized concept to the Bush presidency, which at times worked to his disadvantage. But these acts of kindness and this all-encompassing sense of the humanity of himself and the office carried on long after he left it.
It's like Lyndon Johnson once said, people always remember who comes to your mom and dad's funeral. And George Bush was an extension of that. And I think he was sincere about his kindness, but people never forget kindness, especially in difficult times.
And let me just point out that we are seeing these buses that are arriving because the full extended Bush family is all traveling together. And so as they will gather at the funeral home, they'll then be taken on these buses, which is about a 40-minute ride or so to the Air Force Base. And so that's kind of the family gathering together and to travel together.
And we're talking about these notes, which is on the one hand a mark of what Bob was talking about earlier, this empathy, the idea that you know what somebody else is going through. George Bush calling up Al Gore after he lost to his son, saying, I know what it's like to lose. A key part of leadership. And Susan, those notes also represent those relationships over the year. Those are the relationships that get things done in Washington. I mean, that's how people know to trust somebody on the other end of a conversation and not always be judging their motives. That's why when we talk about a different generation, that's what we're talking about.
You know, it's also helpful in making progress internationally. One of the things that George H.W. Bush told his staff was he didn't want the first call he made to a foreign leader to be one where he was asking for a favor. So he would call almost every night. He would routinely making calls to foreign leaders to say, how you doing, what's going on, so that when he needed to do something like build a coalition to expel Iraqi forces from Kuwait, he knew the leaders he was trying to deal with, and they knew him. And it made it much easier to kind of forge that really remarkable coalition.
You know, you think about President George H.W. Bush and Barbara Bush. They had 6 children. Of course, Robin, that died at 3 of leukemia. The other 5, big families, and they are all there, gathered there at the funeral to pay homage to their grandfather or father. And Omar Villafranca is outside the funeral home. Omar?
Nora, we're starting to see some of the family members arrive. 3 very large black buses just pulled up here to the funeral home. And of course, there was a heavy police presence as it is, and there was a little bit of scurrying when the buses arrived. We're expecting them to obviously step out. It'll be a very quick ceremony here, just a few minutes before they load up into the motorcade and start that 26-mile ride to Ellington Field. More than 24 police officers on motorcycles are here on standby, waiting to lead the family to Ellington Field. We're waiting to see as they get off the buses here. There is a hearse. It's got a seal on the side of it and 2 American flags. That's where the former president's casket will go. And we're waiting to see exactly what family members, as they're starting to get off the bus right now, are going to be here for this ceremony. And as Bob Schieffer mentioned, you always remember who comes to your mom and dad's funeral. So there's 350 dignitaries, Houston members of the city council and commissioners waiting at Ellington Field to see the former president off. As we talked to the mayor yesterday, he told us he was the former president who just happened to live next door. He became the fabric of this community when the city needed help. And now members of the Bush family are getting off that bus there to go inside and get ready for the motorcade procedure.
I see Pierce Bush, the grandson and son of Neil Bush, one of the presidents. Yes. The dog, of course, has arrived, and that was really part of honoring and helping the veterans as well. But Susan, you know Ellington Field.
You know, when President Bush was defeated and his successor was inaugurated, the plane then took him and a small group back to Ellington Field. And this was a very difficult time for George Bush because he had been defeated. He had expected that after the great triumph of his foreign policy, he would be reelected. He had been defeated by a man he thought was a lesser man than him, Bill Clinton. It took a long time for their friendship to develop. They were pretty down. They landed in Ellington Field, and there's a crowd that's gathered to greet them, which they didn't expect. And when they then are driven by the Secret Service to the house they had rented while their new house was being built, there were Houstonians lining the streets. There was a couple in a pickup truck holding a sign that said "Welcome Home." George and Barbara. And Barbara Bush told me this story in an interview I did just at the end of 2017, and tears welled up in her eyes, remembering this couple in 1993 who made a sign, stood on the back of their truck, and held it up.
You know, there has been a cartoon that has been making its way around that many people have looked at, and it's that image of President Bush arriving in heaven and greeting his wife of 73 years, Barbara Bush, and his daughter, who passed away at age 3. And that thought is so comforting for many people.
I think that it was a wonderful drawing, I thought. But, you know, we're talking about how the Republican Party has changed. Washington has changed. I mean, when I came to Washington back during the Hoover administration, actually it was a little after that, but in those days, it was a community where everybody knew everybody. People lived here. They brought their families here. Their wives knew each other. The kids knew each other. And now it's a community of strangers. They come to Washington. They don't move their families here. They live here they're in town for 2 or possibly 3 days and then back to the home district to raise money. And it has changed Washington for the worst. I know I sound like an old guy when I say that, but it has changed dramatically.
Well, I was talking to a Republican senator recently who was saying just that thing, which is, I don't really know my colleagues because we operate in silos. Even when we're here physically together, we've all got individual agendas. And Major, the reason, again, that this is important is it's not just that people don't go to cocktail parties and don't get to hang out and have nice chats. It's that this is the social lubrication that allows things to get done.
Right, but the changes that Bob talked about in part reflect the changes in our country. Congress now is also much more ethnically diverse. It is more diverse by gender. Back in the 60s and 70s and 80s, it was a white men's club, predominantly. And there was a sort of general sense of American experience among these white men. And I'm not saying it was bad or inferior. I'm just saying it's dramatically different now. Who's in Congress? What does Congress look like? And the partisan shells or silos are much more harder and reinforced now than they were then. And that is the big difference. But to point about Bob was making about the Republican Party, look, I spent a lot of time covering the rise of Newt Gingrich as a congressional reporter. Newt Gingrich were here, he would say, look, 40 years of Democratic rule in the House had to end. And the only way to end it was to be confrontational. That was not George H.W. Bush's way, but it was my way. And once we confronted Democrats, then we won our majority, and we were able to achieve things that Republicans had long sought to achieve. And that was the only way to get there. The Bush way wasn't the only way. And the new Republican Party had a choice. And the new Republican Party took Newt Gingrich's confrontational choice more than H.W.'s. Not to say one is necessarily better or worse than the other, but it was a choice made in public with a thorough Republican Party debate. And that hard-edged Gingrich approach has stood for, at least Republicans, the test of time.
But, you know, the result of that is as the Republican Party has moved further to the right, the Democratic Party has moved further to the left, and the distance between the two parties is greater now and deeper now than it has ever been.
Just one sign of the difference between the two when Newt Gingrich helped bring down Speaker Jim Wright and helped get that Democratic leader basically kicked out of Congress. George W. Bush put out a press release talking about Wright's service to the country. Newt Gingrich was demonizing him, and George Bush, the president, was talking about the service Wright had done to the country. Kind of another example of the difference between what you're talking about, maybe.
Right. This idea that H.W. Bush was a product of a time of minority Republican orientations to power. You had to ask Democrats to get what you wanted. Newt Gingrich said, no, we have got to flip that script, put Republicans in charge, put the Republican agenda first, and have Democrats come to us, and we'll cut our deals with them on our terms, not theirs. And that was a seminal moment for the Republican Party. It was a seminal moment for the H.W. Bush presidency, and it has cast a shadow that brings us, in some respects, not all, to the Trump presidency we have now.
And we are about to begin the departure ceremony as we lay to rest the last president of the greatest generation, President George H.W. Bush. His family gathering in Houston there together at the George H. Lewis Sons Funeral Home. And we're told that when the coffin exits the funeral home, there will be a member of each branch of the military lining the path for the coffin to go to the salute. The pallbearers, members of the Secret Service who have guarded this president and kept him safe for many years, as well as many members of his family. And as those who've worked in the White House can tell you, they become like family as well because you spend so much time with them. You always have them by your side. It's hard to get any alone time because you're being guarded. So there is a special bond that exists between those special members of law enforcement and Secret Service that develop a bond with the family.
They know a lot of stuff, too.
They know the secrets.
Yeah. Not to put too fine a point on it.
Yes, exactly.
Yes,
you got to keep them close.
That's right. And we should note that Bianna Golodriga has been leading our coverage from down in Houston. Bianna?
Yeah, Nora, one family member who was not at the funeral home, we've just been told, and will be meeting the body and the rest of the family at Ellington Field is former President George W. Bush. He and Laura Bush will be meeting and reuniting with the family there to get on that 747 to fly to the nation's capital. I want to go back to what Susan was mentioning, the significance of the city of Houston to the former president and the first family. This city was family for them, and the president not only felt like he left the country down when he lost re-election in '92, but he felt that he left the city down. And of course, that was not the case. They moved to this city as a young family in 1959. George Bush was, in fact, the first Republican congressman to represent the city of Houston. And along the way, all of those years, they participated in the Houston Marathon. They participated in going to the rodeo. That was one of their favorite outings. And he really helped put Houston on the map. If you think back to his death falling upon the G20, back in 1990, he brought the G7. It was much smaller then, but he brought the G7 here to the city of Houston to really make it an international city and shine some light on the city that he called home, his adopted hometown. They lived just a few blocks away from here, and they came to church every weekend here at St. Martin's Episcopal Church. I sat down with their reverend, and he was talking to me about how important it was for them to come here every week, and they have a congregation of 9,500, and how important that sermon yesterday, Sunday morning, was for this congregation. One would imagine that the whole sermon would be comprised about talking about the president, but of course not when it comes to this president, who did not like the word I. It was not about him. The Reverend Levinson opened up by saying, let's all take a deep breath and let's acknowledge the remarkable life of the man, the president, number 41, and the remarkable life that he led. And with that, I want to turn to Jan Crawford, because he really didn't like making it about himself. It's a lesson his mother taught him.
That's exactly right. And I think when we think about how his legacy will be defined and how historians will debate it for generations, it's important to keep in mind that he is really the professional and the personal and that common theme of public service and integrity and dignity. But one thing I find so striking when we're having this conversation,
and then, Jan, let me just interrupt you, because as we see, the family is coming out of the funeral home now, so let's go back to that. But I want to go back to Washington as we look at these family members. There's his son, Neil, who lived just next door to him here in Houston. He was there the moment his mother passed away. He was there the moment his father passed away. The grandchildren are there as well. This is something, John and Nora, that this country, this family had been prepared for, but it's never easy when that moment does come. This is a president who's had many scares in the past and has fought through them. This is one, obviously, that he was not able to fight through, as we hear other family members and other children walking out.
Bianna, let's pause for a moment now as we see the casket being carried into the hearse. Witnessing the departure of former President George H.W. Bush from Houston, and his family there gathered with him. That is his son, Neil Bush, and most of his children, his wife, Maria, and their family. They've got Sully, the dog, with them, who is going to be going to Washington as well, and then will be going on to Walter Reed to help other veterans in their care and in their recovery. There you can see the hearse there with a presidential seal on it and flags. And you can see those black buses, which are carrying the extended Bush family that has gathered there and will be brought. It's about, they tell us, about a 40-minute drive to Ellington Field. At Ellington Field is President George W. Bush, the 43rd President of the United States, along with his wife, Laura Bush. And there will be a departure ceremony there that is befitting of this president, with the ceremony, as many in the family have said, important not only to honor the life of former President George H.W. Bush, but also to celebrate the legacy and his accomplishments. As George W. Bush told us in our interview for 60 Minutes, he believes he will be viewed by the long lens of history as the greatest one-term president in American history. And certainly his life of 94 years spanned some of the most important geopolitical events of our time, and domestic events too. It really was an extraordinary life, a life well lived that began as a young man who enlisted in the Navy. And from then on, kept serving his country, always.
So this concept of career politician is downgraded, if not disdained, in American politics now. Career politicians are skilled because they are survivors. And one of the key concepts I think President George H.W. Bush brought to his presidency was a concept less appreciated in American politics now. We have a very thorough understanding in American politics right now of what my party needs or what my individual political agenda needs. The key in politics, successful politics, is understanding what your opponent needs. What is your opponent's motives? What's your opponent's background? Where does your opponent come from? What do they need to make sure a deal is workable for them? Understanding more than yourself, understanding what your opponent's strengths, weaknesses, vulnerabilities, and motives are. George H.W. Bush is part of a generation in politics who understood that fundamental truth and the hard work behind making that fundamental truth workable.
You know, you said that he may be seen as the most consequential one-term president we've had, and it's a kind of a object lesson for journalists to not assume you know everything in the moment. That is not a judgment I think people would have made at the time he was defeated for re-election, was heading back to Houston. He seems more consequential as more time goes on. His decision on Iraq not to push forward to Baghdad, which was criticized at the time by many, now looks like a very wise thing to do. The way he handled the end of the Cold War and the negotiations with a disintegrating Soviet Union now looks so important. It was so crucial to not having violence or warfare at the end of the Cold War. So he looks bigger as time goes on. I think that happens to presidents. Some of them look better as time goes on. Some of them look smaller as time goes. They turn out to be less consequential than we thought in the moment.
Bianna Golodryga is in Houston. Bianna?
And I will tell you, Nora, those people who live on the streets, that are lucky enough to live on the streets where this motorcade is going to be passing through, are going to be coming outside. It's a beautiful day today, but they would have come outside in the rain, snow, no matter what weather, to say goodbye and to salute their commander-in-chief and their next-door neighbor. He really was the man next door. He went to the basketball games here for the Houston Rockets. He loved, oh man, did he love the Houston Astros. You'd see him at both the Oilers game and obviously when the Oilers became the Texans, he was there as well. He was really someone who was one of the city's best cheerleaders. And when you come to a high-class problem like this church behind me has with a congregation of 9,500, where the Reverend had to send out notes saying, listen, both for when Barbara passed away and now when the President passed away, the services will be private. Everyone thinks they're invited because everyone thinks that they were the President and First Lady's good friends. That's how close they were with the neighbors and with the community here. And Jan, this goes back to the conversation we were having about the President not wanting to talk about himself. It was all about service and giving and caring about others.
And we can see his legacy when you see his family coming in, the grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and their devotion to public service. But I think when we think about President Bush and that legacy, it's almost impossible to overstate his impact on something that we haven't even mentioned yet, and that's the United States Supreme Court. That in many ways could be his most lasting legacy, because for all of the discussions about that he was an establishment politician, he was someone who could kind of bring both sides together to create consensus and get things done. He is responsible for putting on the Supreme Court the most conservative justice, a conservative icon, Justice Clarence Thomas, who is beloved by conservatives. Now, he got another nomination, obviously Justice Souter, who became a liberal and a disappointment to conservatives. But that affected the Supreme Court, too, because subsequent presidents, Republican presidents, vowed never to put a David Souter on the court, and they did their homework more. And so as a result, their nominations were more conservative. George H.W. Bush really did start to turn the court in a more conservative direction. And that's where we see it today.
And when we heard of the name Anita Hill came into the picture, and knowing that this nomination was in jeopardy and the controversy that would ensue, many other presidents could have said, listen, let's find another nominee. This is not worth fighting for. He stood by Clarence Thomas, and he fought for that nomination.
He always believed in Clarence Thomas, as did many American people. At a divisive time, he wanted to nominate Clarence Thomas earlier and decided that he would first put David Souter on the court to replace Justice Brennan. Justice Thomas, of course, replacing that liberal icon, Thurgood Marshall, and becoming a conservative icon in his own right. He is an intellectual heavyweight on that court. He is one of the most forceful voices of conservatism on the Supreme Court. And in fact, of all of the nominees that President Trump has put on the federal appeals court since he's been in office, more of those have been Clarence Thomas clerks when they were coming out of law school than any other justice. So you can't overstate Justice Thomas's influence in the legal community and on the courts, and that is a result of George H.W. Bush.
Yeah, and once again highlighting, though it may have been a shorter presidency than George H.W. Bush had hoped for, obviously it had lasting impact, Nora and John, as I send it to you, lessons that he passed on to his son as well. But what was also fascinating was that when his son did become president, he put the brakes on and sat in the shadow, never wanting to overshadow the president that would follow, of course, that being his son.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Major, you reacting to that as well.
Just building off Jan's point about the Supreme Court, when Donald Trump was a candidate in 2016 in March, I recount this in my book, Mr. Trump's Wild Ride, he has a meeting about putting together a list of Supreme Court nominees if he becomes the Republican nominee. And the first thing he says in that conversation with a guy named Leonard Leo, who leads the Federalist Society, spent 30 years trying to get conservative jurists on the court, I don't want a Souter. That's Trump saying that. And that's when this leader of this conservative movement on remaking the federal judiciary says, Trump's got something going. That list that Donald Trump, the candidate, puts together has 2 lifetimes in the general election campaign and is crucial to many Republicans who are otherwise uncertain about whether they could live with Donald Trump or would even support him. But the future of the Supreme Court and his orientation to it, and this idea of being serious about grooming and selecting conservatives to be on the court, is probably as important to anything within the Republican Party to Trump winning that election as anything else.
All right, Major, Susan, Bob, thank you. And we will be back for another CBS News special report for the military send-off at Ellington Field Joint Reserve Base as we pay homage to the last president of the greatest generation. Coverage will continue throughout the day on your local news, on the CBS station, and our 24-hour streaming network, CBSN. You can watch it at cbsnews.com. Many of you will return now to CBS This Morning on the West Coast, and this has been a CBS News special report with Bianna Goladriga in Houston and John Dickerson. I'm Nora O'Donnell, CBS News, Washington.
So we've been watching a CBS News special report following the journey of President Bush, his final journey from first here Texas heading to D.C. and then back down again. What you were watching and what you're seeing right now is a motorcade. The president is in one of those vehicles. It's being followed by several vehicles holding members of the Bush family. They have just left George H. Lewis and Sons Funeral Home, and they'll be heading to Ellington Field. Once they're at Ellington Field, there will be a military ceremony before the president leaves and heads towards Washington, D.C., where he will lie in state for several days. So this is, you know, a somber and sort of moving time. You can see people lining the streets to say their final farewells to the president. And what we've been doing over the past day or so is sort of recapping his life and his legacy, talking to people who knew him, who worked alongside him, and of course, many of the journalists here at CBS News that covered him. And I want to take you now to the small town in New England, the town of Kennebunkport, Maine. That's where President George H.W. Bush and his wife, Barbara, were local celebrities and pillars of the community. Mr. Bush and his wife spent roughly 3 to 4 months a year at their Walker's Point home, and now residents are grappling with the loss of both of them in just 1 year. Kate Taylor is a reporter for the New York Times, and she wrote about Bush's legacy in Kennebunkport. Can you hear me, Kate? There you are.
I can. Thanks for having me.
So I found this very interesting because, of course, we're talking about a former president and the first lady. But in Kennebunkport, they were citizens. They were longtime citizens. President Bush had been traveling and spending summers there since long before he was president. How are residents there reacting to news of his death?
Well, they were very sad. Obviously, it was not unexpected. He had been in failing health for many years. Some of them had said their goodbyes to him this summer when he was there. He actually just left in October. And I spoke to one man in particular, the golf professional at the local golf club, who was a very close friend, who had played hundreds of rounds of golf with him over the years and gone on fishing trips with him. He had had an emotional goodbye with him in October. And people got the news like many of the rest of us did, reading about it in the media. And they were talking with each other, trading emails, talking downtown. The town had just begun its annual week of Christmas festivities, so the town was very bustling this weekend. And people were really talking about their memories of him and mourning his loss.
This is a man who traveled the world, but I read in an interview that he said he would always return to Kennebunkport. He called it his anchor and an area of the country or town that kept him humble. What did the town mean to the Bush family?
So, yeah, he used the phrase anchor to windward, which means an anchor that a ship drops in the middle of a storm if it wants to just sit tight and prevent a wreck. And it meant that it was a place of retreat for him. He had, as you said, been going there since he was a child. He loved to drive his speedboat at full throttle up and down the coast. He loved to fish. He loved to play golf. And it was a place where he could retreat to the compound that had been in his family's possession for over 100 years, and he could also be a regular citizen and go into town and talk to people and make friends. And obviously, it brought the town to great prominence when he was president. It was known as the Summer White House, and foreign leaders like Mikhail Gorbachev and Margaret Thatcher went to meet with him there. So the town really felt like they had a front seat to history during that time. And then over the years since then, he still had a Secret Service detail, but it was lower key, and he just became a beloved neighbor to many people there.
You know, earlier in the day, we played a little portion of a 60 Minutes interview with George W. Bush, and he talked about how he was preparing to meet with Vladimir Putin and grappling with where the best location might be. And he asked his father, can I take him to Kennebunkport, which he did. And he talked about how honored Vladimir Putin was, how impressed he seemed to be, and how he took him on a boat ride, and he seemed thrilled by it. I also read that George H.W. Bush, that was the first place that he met Bill Clinton. So though this was a place where the family gathered and clearly quite intimate, they were also able to sort of parlay it into a place to bring outsiders as well.
They did. But, you know, one thing that's interesting, there have been a lot of reflections in recent days on George H.W. Bush's presidency and how that political era was different from today's, and how his presidency was, of course, very different from the current presidency. And it's a really striking contrast if you think about his relationship to Kennebunkport compared to Donald Trump's retreat, which is, of course, to his golf club Mar-a-Lago, where you have all these conflicts of interest. You have people paying to be part of this club where they're essentially buying access to the president, spending a lot of money to be able to buttonhole him at dinner about their particular interest before the government or their ideas. And in contrast, you have George Bush, who found this place a tremendously peaceful, rejuvenating retreat, and the Bushes really tried to not be disruptive to the local community during his presidency, but they also were just really part of the fabric of the community. And so it's quite a contrast.
I think that is such a very interesting observation, the comparison. Very, very interesting. Barbara and George, when they were in the town of Kennebunkport, were they celebrities, or was the town sort of used to them?
Both. They were absolutely celebrities, and of course the town is a tourist town, so it's only about 4,000 residents year-round, and then it balloons during the summer. So there are often, you know, visitors there from out of town to whom a Bush sighting was particularly exciting. But it was exciting to everyone. But they also were very close friends with everyone from the proprietor of the family grocery store that they went to, the owners of a general store in town whose lesbian wedding the Bushes were actually witnesses at in 2013. They were involved with the local historical society and the Conservation Trust. They had very everyday relationships with the people in that town, even while they were its most famous residents.
You know, somehow that does not surprise me. That certainly sounds like it remains true to what everyone has said about them as a couple, and no surprise that this was their retreat. Kate, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so we have a lot more news to cover here. Of course, we're going to continue to cover the next few days, the honoring of President George Bush as he makes his way towards the nation's capital for the last time, and then returning back home to Texas for the last time. You're watching a motorcade there where the president's casket is in one of the vehicles. The buses behind, you will find the extended Bush family, siblings, cousins, nieces, nephews. There are actually a couple of buses loaded up there, and they are traveling to Ellington Field, where there will be a brief military ceremony at Ellington Field before the family is escorted from the motorcade to near where the hearse is. And then there will be a final salute, a 21-gun salute, as the casket of the former president heads off to Washington, D.C. We're going to take a quick break right now. We are following the former President George H.W. Bush on his final journey to the nation's capital. What you're looking at right here is a motorcade. Inside one of the hearse there is the flag-draped casket of George H.W. Bush, and followed by several buses filled with members of the extended Bush family. The motorcade is heading to Ellington Field, which is where the president's body will be then transported onto Air Force One. Before that happens, though, there's going to be a formal military ceremony. Air Force One will then fly the president's body to Washington, D.C. And Air Force One is on a special mission. It's called Special Air Mission 41 in honor of the 41st president. So hi, everyone. Good to see you. I'm Anne-Marie Green. We've been covering the ceremonial sending off, if you will, of George H.W. Bush all morning long. You can see the crowd that's gathered there at awaiting the president at Ellington Field. A pretty large crowd, but there's been a crowd pretty much all along the way, a crowd along the street following the motorcade where they can, and a crowd in Tanglewood where the funeral home was. There, as we mentioned, there's going to be a brief ceremony before the casket is transported onto Air Force One. It should be flying off perhaps within the next half hour or so, arriving at at Joint Base Andrews, in Maryland at around 12:30 p.m. local time. The motorcade then leaves the Air Force Base and heads to the Capitol. There will no doubt be members of the public along the route saying goodbye to the president. The motorcade then heads to the Capitol, and the president will be lying in state for several days there in the Capitol. We want to head over to Omar Villafranca. He is actually at the funeral home in Houston. Omar, I saw several busloads of the extended Bush family arriving before we saw the casket. What was the mood like there?
It was very solemn. Obviously, at 94 years old and with health scares in the past, this was something that they were expecting, but obviously it's a shock when it happens. Inside that bus was members, as you mentioned, of the extended members of the Bush family, including Neil Bush and Sully, the president's service dog, was also there. They came on 3 buses. They came out, went briefly inside, then they came back outside as the casket was brought out and loaded into a hearse that had 2 American flags on it and a presidential seal. And then they were escorted by 21, what we counted, Houston police motorcycles to kind of cut through the 26-mile trek to Ellington Field. This is the 4th largest city in the U.S., and of course it's a little bit of traffic going on, so that's going to help them get there. Once they get to Ellington Field, as you mentioned, there's about 350 people waiting for them. Houston City Council members, Houston County Commissioners, and also other luminaries from the community here in Houston, really there to see the president's casket off. After talking to the mayor, Sylvester Turner, he was telling me that George H.W. Bush was basically the president next door here in Houston. People would see him at restaurants. He would show up at Astros and Texans game. He really, him and the family became really part of the fabric of the community here in Houston. Post-Harvey, he was helping out. Post-Katrina, he was helping out. And that's why his service continued after the presidency, and which is why you're seeing large crowds, even some people on the side of the road holding flags or just sitting there to honor the president as he heads to Ellington Field.
Yeah, it's funny that you would bring that up. I saw a woman earlier talking about how, yes, Texas is a red state, but Houston tends to be particularly progressive. But none of that really mattered when it came to the Bush family. How people voted really didn't matter. The entire family is loved in the city of Houston.
Absolutely. And an interesting note, Sylvester Turner, the mayor, told me that the city is vying for the 2020 Democratic National Committee to come here to have their big convention here. And President Bush, unprompted, sent out a tweet saying Houston would be a fantastic place for the Democrats to host their convention. This is the man who was not only the standard bearer for the Republican Party, but was head of the RNC, and he's putting that out there because, as you mentioned, it didn't matter about money. It didn't matter about politics. When it came to Houston, anything that was good for Houston, he would absolutely be for. Interesting note, where he's going to be laid to rest is College Station. maybe about 90 miles away from here. It'll be a good little trek. He's actually going to be loaded onto a special train and taken there by rail to College Station. He was a rock star, to say it bluntly, at Texas A&M. He would show up to football games on Saturday, and you couldn't tell if the people were cheering for the players on the field, or you'd have to look up because there might have been a camera on the president there just waving on and enjoying football games. So the loss here is definitely being felt by Houstonians and Texans at large.
I can only imagine. Omar Villafranca, thank you very much. We are going to head over to Ellington Field, a Joint Reserve Base, and that is where CBS News national correspondent Chip Reed has been standing by. We've been showing some shots of the area. Chip, I can see many, many people, looks like maybe perhaps a couple hundred people lined up waiting for the president to arrive.
That's right, and they're waiting. He should be here shortly. And behind me, of course, you can see what we all know as Air Force One. But technically speaking, it's only Air Force One when the current president is on board. So for this very special mission, they're calling it Special Air Mission 41 in honor of the 41st president. That is the same plane that just brought President Trump back from Argentina from the economic conference he attended there. And he authorized it to be turned around, reset, and sent back here for this mission. Now, when the motorcade arrives, there will be a brief ceremony here, including a 21-gun salute, and the Joint Honor Guard will, with military precision, of course, move the casket from the hearse in the motorcade into the plane. Welcoming the president here will be his son, George W. Bush, the former president, the 43rd president, and his wife, former First Lady Laura Bush, also Neil Bush, George W. Bush's brother, and his family, and of course, as Omar just mentioned, Sully, who will be attending pretty much everything. Sully is the service dog who has been attending to President Bush ever since his wife, Barbara Bush, after 73 years of marriage, passed away earlier this year. And Sully, of course, brought tears to many people's eyes, including this correspondent's, when they released that photo yesterday of Sully standing vigil, or lying down vigil, in front of the president's flag-draped casket. As I mentioned, there will be a ceremony here, and after that, the plane will take off with Bush family members and Sully on board, going back to Joint Base Andrews in Washington, where there will be a whirlwind of activities until Wednesday, when President Bush is flown back here for a funeral service and a private burial at the Bush Presidential Library at Texas A&M University. Anne-Marie?
Indeed, Chip, thank you so much. So, of course, President George H.W. Bush's political life was part of a robust family legacy. His father, Prescott Bush, was a U.S. Senator from Connecticut. Mr. Bush, and his son, President George W. Bush, are only the second father and son duo to occupy the Oval Office. The other is John Adams and John Quincy Adams. Jan Crawford has more on the past and future of the Bush political dynasty.
Well, historians may debate the legacy of George H.W. Bush for decades, but when you think about the personal and the professional, there's a common theme that emerges, and that's a commitment to public service.
The country was together, and everyone wanted to do one's duty. I just had that driving feeling that I ought to go into the service.
In both his military career and in political life, George Herbert Walker Bush was driven by a sense of duty.
He's often said that any definition of a successful life must include service to others. And that just defines most of his life.
Tim Mcbride served as Mr. Bush's personal aide.
Are you carrying the president's bags here?
Yep, that was my job.
And saw the president as a father figure. Mcbride was with Bush on Inauguration Day in 1989. Minutes before he was to be sworn in as president, Mr. Bush made a curious observation.
President-elect Bush notices that Mrs. Reagan is bundling up very snugly President Reagan.
He's going to wear a coat.
He's going to wear a coat. She's wrapping a scarf around him. He is clearly ready for much colder conditions.
So the president-elect demanded his own coat.
And I said, well, sir, your coat's down in the car. We won't get it in time. It's not possible. He said, well, I need it. I can't go out looking more robust than President Reagan.
But what I have proposed
Despite his empathy, Mr. Bush lost his re-election bid in 1992.
I, George Walker Bush, do solemnly swear.
By 2001, another Bush, George W., was back in the Oval Office.
As I recall, the conversation went something like this. Welcome, Mr. President. It's good to see you, Mr. President. And that's all we said.
They'll remember him for being a good, honest president who got a lot of things done. But I think the thing I take pride in is integrity.
Proud as he was, according to Mcbride, Mr. Bush did not set out to build a political dynasty.
None of that motivated him, or I believe motivates any of his family.
A sentiment Jeb Bush, the former Florida governor, echoed when he ran for president in 2016.
The idea of being a Bush, I know it's complicated for people looking at it on the outside. I can distinguish between being proud to be a member of this extraordinary family and also recognizing I got to go make this case myself.
Amid declarations that he was doomed by his last name, Jeb Bush dropped out of the GOP primary.
I once heard someone just say that the Times choose the president.
You think his last name was Smith, he would have had a better chance?
I think running as a Bush would have been tough in 16 for any candidate. But beyond that, there were other factors that caused the voters to look somewhere else, I think.
Voters may one day look toward yet another Bush, Jeb's son, George Prescott.
I, George Prescott Bush.
Currently, the Texas Land Commissioner, George P. Bush, seemed destined to join the family business.
I pledge allegiance to the flag.
At 12 years old, he led the Pledge of Allegiance at the Republican National Convention that nominated his grandfather. Now the fourth generation of his family to enter politics, George P. did so with his uncle's blessing.
He's always thought that I'd be good at it. But in terms of doing it for the right reasons, that's what the consensus was, whether it was him or my grandfather or my dad, is you've got to do this with a servant's heart.
With the unwavering heart of a servant, Mr. Bush leaves behind a legacy that transcends politics.
You can't believe what our grandchildren do. They all do something for others. They do public service. They do something for others.
Now, George P. Bush is one of the most popular politicians in Texas, where that Bush family name still resonates. And even if he decides not to run for president, there are 16 Bush grandchildren and 8 great-grandchildren who could someday enter public service. Anne-Marie?
All right, Jen, thank you. In a rare set of interviews, 3 former presidents spoke about the life and legacy of President George H.W. Bush. Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, and George W. Bush sat down with 60 Minutes to share personal experiences with the 41st president. And in an excerpt that you didn't see on last night's broadcast, the 43rd president told Norah O'Donnell a little bit about his unique connection with his father.
So much has been written about George Herbert Walker Bush as a president. What was he like as a father?
He was a great father. And if you were to interview my brothers and sister to a person, we would say, couldn't have a better father. And I think the reason why they would say, I know the reason why I'd say it is because he gave us unconditional love. And some of us tested it, I might add. There was no doubt about how much he loved us, which I think is a very important gift that a father can give to his children.
It's been one of the great joys of my life, my friendship with him. Our arguments were good-natured and open, and we continue to debate things all the way up until recently.
He was a good reminder that as fiercely as we may fight on policy and on issues, that ultimately we're Americans first. And that kind of attitude is something that I think a lot of people miss.
When you look back at your father's term in office as president,
yeah,
he starts to many people look better and better.
Yeah, we all do. That's the way time works. I think he's going to go down as the greatest one-term president ever because of his foreign policy, deftly handling the end of the Cold War, for example, reunification of Germany.
George W. Bush also told us what he learned from his father about personal diplomacy.
Here's a George Bush story. One of the things I learned from him was to give these world leaders kind of special treatment, if possible. And I said, Dad, I need a place to bring Vladimir Putin. would you mind if I brought him to Kennedy-Bunkport, knowing full well that Putin would say, wow, this is really great. And he said, not at all. And so Putin lands, and there's Dad at the foot of the stairs to greet him. So he said, you want to go out in our boat? And Putin said, oh, I'd love to go. And so Putin has this interpreter that's kind of a, it didn't look like much of an outdoorsman. And the old man opens that thing up full blast, and this guy, I'm standing next to this interpreter, is like white knuckles, hanging onto the boat, wondering if he's going to live. And he's cutting through these waves. It's just classic George Bush.
What was Putin doing?
He loved it. Putin's kind of one of these macho dudes that he salt spray coming across, and he thought it was wonderful. Just the interpreter was a little nerve-wracked.
Well, tonight, House and Senate leaders will honor President George H.W. Bush in a Capitol ceremony at 5 p.m. And we'll have live coverage of the service on an extended edition of Red and Blue right here on CBSN. And currently at Ellison Field, what you're watching there is a military ceremony about to get underway. We've been following the motorcade, a hearse there up in the top right-hand corner, carrying the flag-draped casket of George H.W. Bush. When the president arrives at Ellington Field, he will, after the ceremony, be placed on board Air Force One. As you heard from Chip Reed, technically not called Air Force One today because the current president is not traveling on that plane. Today, that plane is called Special Air Mission 41. That plane is headed towards the Capitol. Will arrive in Maryland later on this afternoon, and then the motorcade resumes heading toward the Capitol building, where former President George H.W. Bush will lie in state in the Capitol Rotunda, allowing members of the public and members who served with him and alongside him in the nation's capital to pay their final respects. We're going to take a quick break. You're streaming CBSN, CBS News, always on. Welcome back, everyone. We have been following the final journey of President George H.W. Bush. We can see right there. There you have it. We're going to tell you what you're witnessing right now. Up in your top right-hand corner is the motorcade. We've been following the motorcade since it left a funeral home in the Houston area. Inside one of those hearses right there is the flag-draped casket of George H.W. Bush. Behind him are several buses filled with the extended family of the president, nieces, his children, grandchildren, all following along. That motorcade is heading to Ellington Field. Also inside one of those buses is Sully, the president's loyal Labrador Retriever, a gift to him from America's vet dogs. And Sully was trained to assist the president after his wife Barbara passed away. Sully was able to open doors, pick up objects, and of course, as you know, the president had been in a wheelchair for several years, dealing with a Parkinson's type of illness. So Sully is making the final journey with the president, heading first to this airfield and then off to the nation's capital. On the bigger screen, what you see there are members of the military waiting for the president and his family to arrive. There's going to be a small military ceremony taking place there, including a 21-gun salute at Ellington Field, and then the president's casket will be placed on what is usually known to most of the time to the public as Air Force One. Chip Reed mentioned to us that it's really only technically called Air Force One when the current president is flying on it. So today it has a new name, Special Air Mission 41, in order to transport the former president to the nation's capital one last time. He should be arriving there sometime in the afternoon, and then the motorcade resumes, transporting the casket of George H.W. Bush to the nation's capital, where he will lie in state for several days, giving members of the public as well as those who served with him an opportunity to say goodbye. So throughout the morning, we've been talking about the history and the legacy of this man as well as his family. Bianca Ladriga is in Texas, and she has more on the life and legacy of George H.W. Bush.
Anne-Marie, the late president will be flown in just a few hours from here in Houston to the nation's capital. Yesterday, I had a chance to sit down with Reverend Russell Levinson Jr., who's been the family's pastor for the past 10 years. He was fortunate enough to spend time with both Barbara and President Bush during their final moments of life. When Barbara passed away back in April, she said, "Tell that man that I love him so much," obviously speaking about President Bush. Well, I asked him about President Bush's final moments himself last Friday.
I see history as a book with many pages.
Today, another page in the history book turns.
And each day, we fill a page with acts of hopefulness and meaning.
As the nation honors one of the country's most devoted public servants.
It's a loss not just for Houston, it's a loss to our nation, and it's a loss to the world.
Family pastor Dr. Russell Levinson Jr. was with President Bush at the very end.
You were fortunate enough to be there for not only Barbara's passing, but also the president's. Can you talk about that moment Friday night?
It was as it was with Barbara, a comfortable, dignified, graceful, and in many ways wonderful moment.
This is America.
He built a life around the theme of his most famous speech.
A brilliant diversity, spread like stars, like 1,000 points of light in a broad and peaceful sky.
And shown as a young Navy pilot in World War II, serving decades in government, from CIA director to vice president to the nation's highest office.
So help me God.
Less than a year into his term, the Berlin Wall fell, and a decisive victory for the U.S. military in the Gulf War led to high approval ratings. But he was criticized for not removing Saddam Hussein from power, while some point to a broken campaign promise.
Read my lips. No new taxes.
As one of the reasons he was a one-term president.
And this man whom I'd always liked and respected and then run against in a painful campaign in some ways, I literally came to love.
Putting his love of the country ahead of politics as a former President George H.W. Bush reached across the aisle.
His humility and his decency reflects the very best of the American spirit.
Even offering comfort while he himself was ill to former Vice President Joe Biden, whose son Beau was in a Houston hospital.
He said, I just came to welcome you to Houston and to tell you how badly I feel about Beau.
Because most of all, George Herbert Walker Bush cherished family.
After both Jeb and George were elected governor on the same day, I was flying home to Houston from Florida, and I said to Barbara, this is the happiest day in my life. And she said, what about the day we're married? I said, that was a nice day, too.
President and Mrs. Bush had an unshakable bond, even after her death.
He missed his Barbara, and I won't say he loved her, he loves her.
And in his last moments, close friend and former Secretary of State James Baker said the president spoke his final words in a phone conversation.
The very last words he spoke were spoken to George W. Bush, President Bush 43, who had told him how much he loved him and that he would see him on the other side. And 41 said, I love you too.
The president surrounded by friends and loved ones. And in the final moments, Jim Baker said that the president opened his eyes and asked his dear friend, where are we going, Jim? To which Jim Baker replied, you're going to heaven. And the president said, that is where I want to go. And Reverend Levinson told me about an exchange he had with the president a few months ago in which the president was talking about his daughter Robin. You'll recall his daughter and Barbara's daughter died at the age of 3 from leukemia so many decades ago. Well, the president has always thought about his daughter and was always thinking about being reunited with her. And he asked his family reverend, how old do you think Robin will be? The reverend said, I don't know that, Mr. President, but I know it will be beautiful. We all do. Anne Marie.
Bianna, thank you so much. So we are continuing to cover the final journey of George H.W. Bush as he heads to the nation's capital. What you're seeing on this divided screen up at the top is the motorcade traveling along the highway. We're told the motorcade is roughly about 10 minutes away from Ellington Field. The motorcade, of course, includes the president's flag-draped casket, but also several bus loads of Bush family members, the extended family, including his dog Sully, the dog that was given to him by the America's Vet Dogs shortly after his wife passed away to help assist him. The dog trained to open doors and pick up objects and also call for help should anything happen with the president. And then just on the other side, Ellington Field, where there will be a formal military ceremony, a 21-gun salute to see the president off. We're going to take you to a CBS News special report.
This is a CBS News special report. I'm John Dickerson with Nora O'Donnell in Washington. Former President George Herbert Walker Bush's casket will soon depart for his final trip to Washington. We're waiting for the motorcade carrying Mr. Bush and members of his family to arrive at Ellington Field Joint Reserve Base in southeast Houston in just a few minutes.
There will be a short service there before the president and his family depart. One of the planes that normally serves as Air Force One will carry the former president to Joint Base Andrews, which is just outside Washington, D.C. We saw the Bush family. They gathered, it was about an hour ago, at a Houston funeral home to escort the 41st president to the airfield. Chip Reed is there at Ellington Field. Chip, good morning.
Well, good morning, Nora. You can see behind me the honor guard is ready for this ceremony to begin. You can also see what we all know as Air Force One, but it's only technically Air Force One when the current president is aboard. That is the same plane that just brought President Trump back from the G20 conference in Argentina. He authorized it to turn around and head here for this very special mission, which is being called Special Air Mission 41 in honor of the 41st president. At At this ceremony, which will happen in just a moment, there will be a military honor guard that will very carefully and, of course, with military precision, move the casket from the hearse in the motorcade onto the plane. There will also be a 21-gun salute. President George W. Bush will be here on the tarmac with former First Lady Laura Bush, also several other members of President Bush's family, and, of course, Sully, the dog that brought tears to so many people's eyes. It has been President Bush's service dog ever since his wife Barbara passed away earlier this year, and we all saw that photograph of Sully lying vigil in front of the president's flag-draped casket yesterday. Really an amazing sight, and Sully will join the Bush family for the flight back to Washington, D.C. to Joint Base Andrews, where a motorcade will then take him to the U.S. Capitol, where he will lie in state until Wednesday, when there will then be a memorial service at the National Cathedral. And on Wednesday evening, he will then fly back here to Houston, where there will be a funeral service, and then a train will take him from Houston to College Station to Texas A&M University and the President George H.W. Bush Presidential Library, where there will be a private burial service on Thursday. Nora?
All right, Chip Reed there at Ellington Field, and you can see hundreds of local officials and friends and family have gathered there for a send-off to the 41st President of the United States. We're told they're elected officials from the city, county commissioner, also people from the Points of Light Foundation, the Second Baptist Church there as well, many of the staff there, just people who wanted to be there and say goodbye. The military honor guard there as well, members from every service. President Bush, of course, served in the Navy during World War II, and that's why we say this is the last president of the greatest generation. I noted that the U.S. Navy tweeted when the president passed, "Fair winds and following seas, sir, we have the watch," which was beautifully said. And see, it's a windy day there at the airfield. He will be met there by his son, President George W. Bush, and Laura Bush, who will also greet the other members of the family. This ceremony, everything from what you see right there at Ellington Field to what we will see in Washington when he lies in state, to what's at the National Cathedral, to his burial, all being organized by Major General Michael Howard. He is actually the commanding general of the Joint Force headquarters in the National Capital Region. And he said that this whole ceremony that we're going to watch is the culmination of years of planning and rehearsal to ensure the support the military renders President Bush is, in his words, nothing less than a first-class tribute. And so we get to watch this historic goodbye over the next couple of days. And in some ways, as someone said to me, this is not just saying goodbye to a man, but in many ways an ideal that he represented, John.
Well, we don't. You know, we know what the inaugurations look like. We know what State of the Unions. We know what in politics, these moments are like. This is a fresh, and yet, in a sense, it's also re-upping basic American values that he stood for. Service, duty, honor, and that is not just wrapped up in a presidency. We know about the family, the way George Herbert Walker Bush was raised and the way he raised his children, that those are wrapped into the family themselves. And so this is a national story, but it's also a personal family story that contains all of the things that are being celebrated and honored by those honor-guarded attention and by the flags waving.
So I'll just jump in on the conversation here. It's a moment of institutional appreciation as well, the presidency itself, and, as was mentioned a bit earlier, there are times in American history when we look back on a presidency differently than we did when the presidency ended. George Bush's presidency ended with a spectacular defeat in 1992. He'd won 426 electoral votes in '88. He won 168 just 4 years later. A complete elevator shaft.
In a three-way race against Bill Clinton
and Ross Perot. But his political future looked so much brighter mid-term of that first term of his presidency. What he ended up with seemed almost inconceivable. And for that reason, we've looked back, I think, unappreciatively at his presidency as a political failure, but as a policy and as a foreign policy management presidency stands the test of time. And moments like this, where the country says, wait a minute, what actually happened and what it endures, and these moments come out in institutional celebrations like this.
And they come out in the feet of the people who have walked to the edge of the tarmac to simply watch this happen, who feel some connection to the man, to the office, to the country, and there you see them standing, waiting and watching this unfold because of a connection that they have to their country, and just that physically wanting to be there to witness this. Really gets at something very fundamental about people and the connection to their.
And our colleague Brianna has talked about how Houston loved the Bush family. Before I came to Washington, my last newspaper job was at the Houston Post. I was there for 2 years, and I covered his election night celebration in 1988. It was the first time I'd ever been in the presence of the National Political Press Corps, a press corps I hoped at some point in my career to join. And I remember that night there was something interesting about it, because politics, we all know, can be somewhat hokey and have show demonstrations. And they kept trying to gin up the crowd with call and responses of George Bush, and it never caught on. And one of the reasons it struck me then and strikes me now is because George H.W. Bush had many strengths, but he was not a political showman at any level. He wasn't a rhetorician. He sort of didn't do the whole, it's a presentation part of politics. He did the quieter, harder work of politics, which defined his presidency. But in those moments when either rhetoric or showmanship were called upon, he didn't really have it. But that didn't mean his community didn't love him, didn't mean that there wasn't something deeper about their appreciation of him. He just wasn't really good at the kind of hokier sides of politics.
You know, John Meacham, who is the president's biographer and has really written the definitive work.
Tremendous access to the family and to the H.W. Bush.
He had this anecdote about how Bush, his nickname was called the have-half, because as a kid he would take a candy bar or a cookie and cut it in half and give the half to the other kid. It's almost hard to believe any child doing that, certainly with a candy bar or a cookie. But I think his actions, the president's actions in many years, make that story so believable about concerned about the other. And that was forged, in many ways, I think, by his initial military service.
Well, sure. And remember, when you say the greatest generation, part of that greatest generation is not just World War II, it's the Depression before that, and that sense of scarcity. And that sense of, if not privation, we're not certain what the future is going to hold, either economically or geopolitically. The Great Depression and World War II, formative events for everyone from that generation. And that have-half is like, I've got to take care of the person next to me because we're not sure we're going to get through this together.
Major, what we're seeing here is the motorcade is making its way to the ceremony, and so we expect it to begin shortly. The beginning of the slightly more, about 3.5-hour flight back to Washington, D.C., to Joint Base Andrews, where as President Bush would have landed after all of those campaign stops, all of those whirlwind tours across the world, both as president and as vice president.
And as the Bush family arrives and will be greeted there by former President George W. Bush, we should note that when they reach Washington, after a brief ceremony in Washington, the 41st president will lie in state. And so anyone who wants to go can go to the Capitol Rotunda and wait in line, and they'll be open all night, and you can have a look at the president's casket, which I still think is really just one of the most amazing things, you know, to think about. It started with President Lincoln and continues to this day for our presidents and special members of Congress like John McCain, who just lied in state, but really a remarkable thing that you can go do that. And so everyone has the opportunity to say goodbye.
And it's a touchstone moment. I remember when Ronald Reagan passed away. I was obviously a reporter in Washington, but I took my children and we stood in line. I didn't cut the line. It was 3.5 hours. And it's a touchstone moment when you walk in the rotunda, that most spectacular architectural space in all of Washington, and it's completely silent, and you make one pass around, and then you walk back outside, and you feel, as an American citizen, you've touched something that is unique and enduring and beautiful about our country.
As we see the cars of the motorcade here, this is the this is the way when you're president, the motorcades arrive like this on the tarmac, and the echoes that must be going through for the Bush family as they've been a part of these processions onto that famous plane, as a part of the president's service, as a part of his son's service, and now echoing for the last trip to Washington. Every detail of this ceremony planned perfectly for the former commander-in-chief. And that's why, of course, the military honor guard there, and we will hear from them shortly, the Army band, as well as a full departure ceremony as well.
And it's worth noting that this is a political dynasty, but a quiet one. I mean, think about it. Prescott Bush, senator from Connecticut. George Herbert Walker Bush, son a president, another son a governor of an enormously important state. And yet, it's not like Camelot, like this huge radiating family dynasty. And yet it is. It's quiet. It's been a part of American politics for decades. And as you said, Nora, this family links arms, tight, loving, and also very, very careful about all details and the best presentation possible of this moment, this legacy, which is at the top right now of this family's enduring political legacy throughout the country.
You see this motorcade essentially circling the tarmac, and what is Air Force One that Chip just pointed out just came all the way from Argentina and back to Houston to make this journey. That is the hearse carrying the 41st president of the United States. The family will be escorted from the motorcade to a position near the hearse by Major General Howard. He's the general I mentioned earlier who is in charge of this entire state funeral and pacing out everything that we're going to see over the next couple of days with military precision. And just to let everyone know, what we're about to see as well is a full honors will be rendered, including 4 ruffles and flourishes and a hail to the chief with a simultaneous 21-gun salute. And we will stop talking when that happens, because we all want to witness that. We're also learning more about the funeral service that will take place at the National Cathedral in Washington. That happens on Wednesday. We've learned that his oldest son, former President George W. Bush, will speak at that service, and former First Lady Laura Bush and their daughter Jenna will give readings. There will also be remembrances from 3 great friends of the 41st president, former Republican Senator Alan Simpson of Wyoming, who we know will be fun to hear from. He's got lots of good stories, always does. Mr. Bush's biographer, John Meacham, who is also not only a beautiful writer but speaker, and the former Canadian Prime Minister, Brian Mulroney. That will happen at the National Cathedral, where we most recently saw tributes to Senator John McCain. And we see now the hearse pulling up to what is being called Special Air Mission 41. On what looks like a very windy day in Houston. The honors will be rendered shortly for our former Commander-in-Chief, who enlisted when he was just 18 years old, becoming one of the youngest, if not the youngest, Navy pilot to fly during World War II, flying 58 combat missions and almost dying in one where 2 of his crewmates passed away. And he has thought about that his whole life, according to his biographer, the 2 crew members who were lost during World War II. There you see the Bush family led by former President George W. Bush and First Lady Laura Bush leading the family onto Special Air Mission 41 after his father's casket was placed on the plane. And this really begins what is a several-day tribute to the former commander-in-chief and his more than 70 years of service to our country.
And you see there the former president waving from the top of the stairs, just as he would have done so many times getting into that plane as president to board. I mean, think of the resonances of this, to board the plane that his father also, you know, the passenger number one on Air Force One, his casket is on. I mean, the echoes, they just continue throughout this moment.
I mean, this speaks to the dynasty of the Bush family, but also just how unique that moment is. The son walking up the stairs as he did before, literally following in the footsteps of his father, politically and for a time as the commander-in-chief of this country, both aboard Air Force One for this final journey. It is as poignant and, as you mentioned, John, resonant as anything you could see in modern-day American politics.
And testament to the Bush size of the Bush family and the friends in Houston is the long line of those joining onto the plane.
In President George H.W. Bush's final moments, he was able to speak to his family. Some were there in the room. George W. Bush was on the phone, and the last words spoken were, "I love you."
Right. And as anyone who's ever been through this craves, you want a loved one, particularly a parent, to die peacefully, without pain, and surrounded by all whom can be with that loved one. Everyone hopes that it's a constant refrain and yearning in human experience, and for this family, and for that moment, and the country can take some measure of peace in that, precisely as you might want it to have happened.
I asked George W. Bush, what's the most important thing your father taught you? And he said the most important thing he ever said to me was, "I love you," unconditional love. And for those two men who have occupied that Oval Office and know the challenges of occupying that office and leading the country, we are watching the departure ceremony in Houston, Texas, at Ellington Field for the 41st President of the United States. His family there, a military honor guard that sent him off with 4 ruffles and flourishes and a hail to the chief and the simultaneous 21-gun salute.
And the casket will fly from here to Joint Base Andrews, landing around 3:30-ish, and then it will be driven to the Capitol. And Ben, when it arrives there at the Capitol, there will be an arrival ceremony and then a service at the rotunda. And then the casket will lie in state, as Nora mentioned. Anybody can go and pay their respects.
And at the Capitol Rotunda will not only be James Baker, his best friend, who was there with him at the end, holding his hand and rubbing his feet, but also Vice President Dan Quayle will also be there in the rotunda, as well as former members of President Bush's cabinet to greet him when he arrives at the U.S. Capitol. I was reminded in reading again about his biography that he had run for the Senate twice and lost in Texas and then was elected to Congress. Just one of the many things that former George H.W. Bush did. He lost in politics many times.
Persevered many times. Had many disappointments. Times he thought something was going to be teed up and he got consolation prizes, awkward consolation prizes at times. And that shows you his dimension of perseverance about not only public service, but his own ambition. Things sometimes go together. It's all right to say it out loud. You can be a public servant and be ambitious at the same time, and he was. And he achieved the presidency in part because of that perseverance and that unwillingness to give in or give up after setbacks.
And it was connected, that loss, that ability to come back after setbacks, connected also to his other quality, which is forgiving those who he had competed with, including Ronald Reagan in the 1980s, who beat him in 1980 in the primaries, and then he went on to be his vice president.
Went on to be his vice president, succeeded him at that convention in 1988 in New Orleans, essentially telling Republican delegates, I'll be the third term of the Reagan presidency, when his third term wasn't like the Reagan presidency. It became a disappointment and a political vulnerability for him within the Republican Party.
Chip Reed is there at Ellington Field. Chip?
Nora, we just saw an extraordinary ceremony. You could have heard a pin drop here if it hadn't been for this incredible wind going on. But I've seen that ceremony so many times, or ceremonies similar around the country and at the U.S. Capitol on many occasions. And it always puts a wrenching in your gut to see it. They do it with military precision, as you have mentioned, and that is to honor the people who are involved in this case. Former President George H.W. Bush. You saw quite a few members of the Bush family get on the plane, along with Sully, the president's service dog, who will be given to a military family when he gets back to Washington, D.C. It's about a 3.5-hour flight back to Washington. There will be a ceremony at Joint Base Andrews and then on to the U.S. Capitol, where he will lie in state until Wednesday. Then there will be a memorial service, and then he will come back here to Houston, and he will be taken by train after a funeral service from here to College Station, Texas. It's a special train outfitted just for this occasion. As you mentioned earlier, Nora, they've been planning this for quite some time, and everything is planned up to every meticulous second of this is planned. And there will then be a private burial ceremony on Thursday at the Presidential Library at College Station, Texas. Nora?
Oh, Chip, and beautiful to see that train that is going to take him to his final resting place, and incredible. There you see it. I can imagine
those colors never look bad. They just don't.
They don't.
Air Force One is the most spectacular plane. We've all had a chance to fly it. It is the most beautiful plane to get off, to get on, and to be under the wing of, waiting for the president to come down. And that characteristic wave at the top of the stairs. It's a wave to the country. It's a wave to the world. It's a wave about what America means. And the plane and the train and all those places are symbols of that.
I'm reminded of something from President George H.W. Bush's inauguration speech, where he said, "We are not sums of our possessions. They are not the measure of our lives. In our hearts, we know what matters. We cannot hope only to leave our children a bigger car, a bigger bank account. We must hope to give them a sense of what it means to be a loyal friend, a loving parent, a citizen who leaves his home, his neighborhood, and his town better than he found it."
Not just words.
He was a loving friend and a dear friend to so many, and he did that by his personal phone calls, his notes, his handwritten notes. People would say he wrote handwritten notes for handwritten notes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, and the people lined there to see him, as they will be lined up for the next several days, including when that train makes its final trip, are testament to just exactly what you just read, Nora, that his life succeeded in fulfilling what he talked about.
His friendship, I mean, his marriage, 73-year marriage with Barbara Bush, what an incredible partnership. Susan Page has a book coming out that will talk about a biography rather, of the former First Lady. That relationship so incredibly meaningful. His relationship with his children, his 6 children, one who passed away at the age of 3, his grandchildren.
And there you hear the engines of Air Force One getting ready to move.
As many presidents have remarked when they left office, the thing that they will miss most in some ways is this plane. It's
literally unforgettable. There's no ride like it. There just isn't. And anyone privileged enough in any capacity to ride that jet never forgets it.
And this in a somber moment. But the whole family on board. Think about that. Although Marvin Bush, one of his sons, and his wife will greet them when they land in Washington at Andrews Air Force Base. And the team at Andrews Air Force Base that has served many presidents knows the Bush family very well. It is a family.
Sure.
It is a family.
And the stories they no doubt will recount of being in that plane at various stages of their various lives, when George W. Bush was a much younger man visiting with his father, and then George W. Bush's children. That plane has been one in which they have experienced the different stages of their lives that they are in now, and I'm sure they have some tales to tell about their time on it.
And remarking about the Bush family and the Bush marriage, as we all remember, in the '92 campaign, this question of values, family values, what they represented, how resonant they were in late 20th century America. Were they changing? Was that change bad for the country? Did what the Bush family represent fit within those changing times, or was it somehow out of step with these changing times? That's a question that's still not completely answered, but as we look back on this family, that was an enduring part of that greatest generation, that post-World War II approach to not just work life, but family life. It's changed in many dimensions since then, and the passing of George H.W. Bush is a marker in that transition in our country about all sorts of values, how they're articulated, how they're lived through, and how the country comes to appreciate them in their many different dimensions and definitions.
President George H.W. Bush, the last president of the greatest generation, and his friends in Houston there to say a final goodbye. And we honor these presidents and talk about them because the history is extraordinary. And he had 1 term in office as president, but 2 terms as Vice President Reagan. And looking back on him, many will say that he was the most prepared man in history to hold that office. You know, a Navy pilot, an oilman, a congressman, a diplomat, head of the CIA, head of the Republican National Committee
at a very tough time,
a vice president. He had an extraordinary, extraordinary career of service.
And, you know, the ceremony we've seen and this plane and the symbols of American government, wrapped into that is this idea of service. And at one point, George Bush was talking about his service, and when he was asked to be CIA director, he talked about the values, and he said one of those values that he had been raised with, quite simply, is that one should serve his country and his president. And so if that is what this president wants me to do, the answer is a firm yes. And that's the automatic yes that you give, and that is really wrapped up in the ceremony that we're watching right now, the automatic yes to your country.
And Special Air Mission 41 is set to depart Houston, Texas, returning to the nation's capital, where the president will lie in state. President George W. Bush said that his father knew that the office is more important than the man, and that one of the jobs of the President of the United States is to strengthen the institution of the presidency and to bring honor to the office. And there's agreement. He did bring, I think, honor to the office. Even if you disagreed with his policies, he served honorably.
And the reason to honor the office and be a steward of it is for moments like this, is that because there's a continuity in the system that is built into the office, and you know that you are a temporary steward of it, and that it endures and has endured for a long time.
Well, and also you hold the role as commander-in-chief and protecting the nation. And hold the lives of men and women in your hands and the decisions you make along with your cabinet. And that is one of the most solemn responsibilities of the commander-in-chief.
And the pressures are relentless. The pressures are constant day to day in the presidency. And one of the things that fortified H.W. Bush's approach to the presidency and his son's was history will judge this over time. I will not concern myself as acutely with the judgments of the moment as the judgments of time.
James Baker, his best friend, who served in multiple capacities in the administration, said that the world changed under George H.W. Bush. It did. It saw the end of the Cold War, where America became the lone superpower. Barack Obama told us at CBS News that the president didn't spike the football at that moment, that he dealt with it with humility. That changed the course of history.
Even though some wished he had spiked the ball, there was a sense that we could have this national moment of triumphalism, and he did not indulge either himself, the institution, or the country in that moment of triumphalism for strategic long-term reasons.
And there you see everyone's camera and iPhone up to record at this moment. We all become, I'm reminded by the iPhone, as someone once told me, that we all now are journalists in some ways. We can record history in different ways. And the departure as well of the Military Honor Guard. And now Special Air Mission 41 makes the journey to Washington, D.C., where there will be an elaborate ceremony on Capitol Hill for President George H.W. Bush, where he will lie in state. And there will be more elected officials, names from history, that if you're a history buff, you will recognize many people that served in his cabinet, and Ronald Reagan before that, who will all be there. Vice President Quayle will be there as well on Capitol Hill, all to welcome him to lie in state, and where anyone can go and pay tribute. Because starting tonight through all the way through tomorrow, you can pay a visit if you like to say goodbye.
And take a measure of the moment.
We should note that coverage of President George H.W. Bush will continue throughout the day on your local news on this CBS station and on our 24-hour streaming network, CBSN. Also, watch it at cbsnews.com. We're going to have another special report this afternoon from Washington when the former president arrives to lie in state at the U.S. Capitol. And there's going to be a full wrap-up tonight on the CBS Evening News with Jeff Glor. This has been a CBS News special report. Major Garrett, thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'm Nora O'Donnell with John Dickerson, CBS News, Washington.
Hi, everyone. I'm Anne-Marie Green. That was the 21-gun salute at Ellington Field just moments ago in honor of former President George H.W. Bush, the nation's 41st president. Right now, the World War II Navy pilot is making his final flight to Washington, D.C. today, where he will lie in state in the nation's capital. Mr. Bush's family, including his eldest son, the 43rd President George W. Bush, and his wife Laura, will accompany the late president aboard Air Force One. But because the Air Force One distinction comes only when the current president is on board, this plane is being called Special Air Mission 41. Mourners lined the tarmac to pay their respects to the 94-year-old who died on Friday, surrounded by loved ones at his home in Houston. The body will return to Texas Wednesday, where the former president will be laid to rest alongside his wife, former First Lady Barbara Bush, and their daughter, Robin, who died at the age of 3 from leukemia. In a rare set of interviews, 3 former presidents spoke about the life and legacy of President George H.W. Bush. Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, and George W. Bush sat down with 60 Minutes to share personal experiences with the 41st president. And in an excerpt that you didn't see on last night's broadcast, the 43rd president told Norah O'Donnell a bit about his unique connection with his father.
So much has been written about George Herbert Walker Bush as a president. What was he like as a father?
He was a great father. And if you were to interview my brothers and sister to a person, we would say, couldn't have a better father. And I think the reason why they would say, I know the reason why I'd say it is because he gave us unconditional love. And some of us tested it, I might add. There was no doubt about how much he loved us, which I think is a very important gift that a father can give to his children.
It's been one of the great joys of my life, my friendship with him. Our arguments were good-natured and open, and we continue to debate things all the way up until recently.
He was a good reminder that as fiercely as we may fight on policy and on issues, that ultimately we're Americans first. And that kind of attitude is something that I think a lot of people miss.
When you look back at your father's term in office as president,
yeah,
he starts to many people look better and better.
Yeah, we all do. That's the way time works. I think he's going to go down as the greatest one-term president ever because of his foreign policy, deftly handling the end of the Cold War, for example, reunification of Germany.
George W. Bush also told us what he learned from his father about personal diplomacy.
Here's a George Bush story. One of the things I learned from him was to give these world leaders kind of special treatment, if possible. And I said, Dad, I need a place to bring Vladimir Putin. Would you mind if I brought him to Kennebunkport, knowing full well that Putin would say, wow, this is really great. And he said, not at all. And so Putin lands, and there's Dad at the foot of the stairs to greet him. So he said, you want to go out in our boat? And Putin said, oh, I'd love to go. And so Putin has this interpreter that's kind of a, it doesn't look like much of an outdoorsman. And the old man opens that thing up full blast, and this guy, I'm standing next to this interpreter, is like white knuckles, hanging onto the boat, wondering if he's going to live. And he's cutting through these waves. It's just classic George Bush.
What was Putin doing?
He loved it. Putin was kind of one of these macho dudes that he salt spray coming across, and he thought it was wonderful. Just the interpreter was a little nerve-wracked.
Well, Kate Taylor is a reporter for the New York Times, and she wrote about the Bush's legacy in Kennebunkport. Kate Taylor is a reporter for the New York Times, and she wrote about Bush's legacy in Kennebunkport. Can you hear me, Kate? There you are.
I can. Thanks for having me.
So I found this very interesting because, of course, we're talking about a former president and the First Lady, but in Kennebunkport, they were citizens. They were longtime citizens. President Bush had been traveling and spending summers there since long before he was president. How are residents there reacting to news of his death?
Well, they were very sad. Obviously, it was not unexpected. He had been in failing health for many years. Some of them had said their goodbyes to him this summer when he was there. He actually just left in October. And I spoke to one man in particular, the golf professional at the local golf club, who was a very close friend, who had played hundreds of rounds of golf with him over the years and gone on fishing trips with him. He had had an emotional goodbye with him in October, and people got the news like many of the rest of us did, reading about it in the media, and they were talking with each other, trading emails, talking downtown. The town had just begun its annual week of Christmas festivities, so the town was very bustling this weekend, and people were really talking about their memories of him and mourning his loss.
This is a man who traveled the world, but I read in an interview that he said he would always return to Kennebunkport. He called it his anchor and an area of the country or town that kept him humble. What did the town mean to the Bush family?
So, yeah, he used the phrase anchor to windward, which means an anchor that a ship drops in the middle of a storm if it wants to just sit tight and prevent a wreck. And it meant that it was a place of retreat for him. He had, as you said, been going there since he was a child. He loved to drive his speedboat at full throttle up and down the coast. He loved to fish. He loved to play golf. And it was a place where he could retreat to the compound that had been in his family's possession for over 100 years, and he could also be a regular citizen and go into town and talk to people and make friends. And obviously it brought the town to great prominence when he was president. It was known as the Summer White House, and foreign leaders like Mikhail Gorbachev and Margaret Thatcher went to meet with him there, so the town really felt like they had a front seat to history during that time. And then over the years since then, he still had a Secret Service detail, but it was lower key, and he just became a beloved neighbor to many people there.
You know, earlier in the day, we played a little portion of a 60 Minutes interview with George W. Bush, and he talked about how he was preparing to meet with Vladimir Putin and grappling with where the best location might be. And he asked his father, can I take him to Kennebunkport, which he did. And he talked about how honored Vladimir Putin was, how impressed he seemed to be, and how he took him on a boat ride, and he seemed thrilled by it. I also read that George H.W. Bush, that was the first place that he met Bill Clinton. So though this was a place where the family gathered and clearly quite intimate, they were also able to sort of parlay it into a place to bring outsiders as well.
They did. But, you know, one thing that's interesting, there have been a lot of reflections in recent days on George H.W. Bush's presidency and how that political era was different from today's, and how his presidency was, of course, very different from the current presidency. And it's a really striking contrast if you think about his relationship to Kennebunkport compared to Donald Trump's retreat, which is, of course, to his golf club Mar-a-Lago, where you have all these conflicts of interest. You have people paying to be part of this club where they're essentially buying access to the president, spending a lot of money to be able to buttonhole him at dinner about their particular interest before the government or their ideas. And in contrast, you have George Bush, who found this place a tremendously peaceful, rejuvenating retreat, and the Bushes really tried to not be disruptive to the local community during his presidency, but they also were just really part of the fabric of the community. And so it's quite a contrast.
I think that is such a very interesting observation, the comparison. Very, very interesting. Barbara and George, when they were in the town of Kennebunkport, were they celebrities, or was the town sort of used to them?
Both. They were absolutely celebrities, and of course the town is a tourist town, so it's only about 4,000 residents year-round, and then it balloons during the summer. So there are often, you know, visitors there from out of town to whom a Bush sighting was particularly exciting. But it was exciting to everyone. But they also were very close friends with everyone, from the proprietor of the family grocery store that they went to, the owners of a general store in town whose lesbian wedding the Bushes were actually witnesses at in 2013. They were involved with the local historical society and the Conservation Trust. They had very everyday relationships with the people in that town, even while they were its most famous residents.
You know, somehow that does not surprise me. That certainly sounds like it remains true to what everyone has said about them as a couple, and no surprise that this was their retreat. Kate, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Here's a live look at the White House where flags here and across the nation really are flying at half-staff to honor the life and the service of former President George H.W. Bush. In a tweet earlier today, the president wrote, "Looking forward to being with the Bush family to pay my respects to President George H.W. Bush." Paula Reed is at the White House with more on the dynamics between Mr. Trump and the Bushes. Paula, we know that the president and the First Lady will be attending the funeral of George H.W. Bush, but he did not attend the funeral of his wife, Barbara Bush. So this is an interesting turn.
And Marie, as you saw there earlier, the president was tweeting that he looks forward to spending time with the Bush family and paying his respects. He is expected to attend the state funeral later this week, and this comes as a surprise to some people because President Trump is known to be widely disliked within the Bush family. Former First Lady Barbara Bush famously told our Norah O'Donnell that she didn't understand why anyone would be voting for then candidate Trump. And the former President Bush Sr. publicly said he didn't like Trump. He described him as a blowhard. And every day, President Trump sort of wages this war against all of the Washington institutions and norms that the Bush family sort of holds so dear, especially Central Intelligence Agency and U.S. intelligence. But for this period of national mourning, it appears both sides are declaring a truce. And really, Anne-Marie, both sides have an incentive to declare this truce and not make this all about President Trump, who, as we know, so easily dominates every story in the U.S. news cycle. And it appears that former President Bush really wanted President Trump to be a part of this as a way to not make this about Trump and instead to make it about his lifetime of public service.
Well, it should be very interesting to see whether or not the current president plays any particular role other than being there. I think this will probably be the first time that the public sees him alongside the other living presidents, probably since his inauguration. And since then, some have been openly critical. Of course, First Lady Michelle Obama wrote a book where she was very plain-spoken about her feelings about President Trump. So I think people will be certainly observing the body language. But you're right, this is a day to honor President George H.W. Bush, and not a day to start talking about comparisons and things of that nature. That's for another day. Paula, thank you so much. All right, everyone, we're going to continue to cover the final farewell to President George H.W. Bush, as well as other news of the day. Right now, we're going to take a quick break, though. Well, today starts week 4 of the El Chapo trial after another stunning week of testimony from a former close friend of Joaquin El Chapo Guzman. Testimony from Miguel Martinez provided background on how Guzman became one of the world's most notorious drug lords. He described the drug operations along with the 4 attempts Guzman allegedly made to